Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you.
Welcome back, wildlings. Taking community spirit to an entire new level, today's story, In the Hills, the Cities, by Clive Barker. Part 1. It wasn't until the first week of the Yugoslavian trip that Mick discovered what a political bigot he'd chosen as a lover. Certainly, he'd been warned. One of the queens at the baths had told him that Judd was to the right of Attila the Hun, but the man had been one of Judd's ex-affairs, and Mick had presumed that there was more spite than perception in the character assassination. If only he'd listened. Then he wouldn't be driving along an interminable road in a Volkswagen that suddenly seemed the size of a coffin, listening to Judd's views on Soviet expansionism. Jesus, he was so boring. He didn't converse, he lectured, endlessly. In Italy, the sermon had been on the way that the communists had exploited the peasant vote. Now, here in Yugoslavia, Judd had really warmed to this theme, and Mick was just about ready to take a hammer to his self-opinionated head. It wasn't that he disagreed with everything Judd said. Some of the arguments, the ones that Mick understood anyway, seemed quite sensible. But then, what did he know? He was a dance teacher. Judd was a journalist, a professional pundit. He felt, like most journalists Mick had encountered, that he was obliged to have an opinion on everything under the sun, especially politics. That was the best trough to wallow in, you see. You could get your snout, eyes, head, and front hooves in that mess of muck and have a fine old time splashing around. It was an inexhaustible subject to devour, a swill with a little of everything in it, because everything, according to Judd, was political. The arts were political, sex was political, religion, commerce, gardening, eating, drinking, farting, all political. Jesus, it was mind-blowingly boring, killingly, love-deadeningly boring. Worse still, Judd didn't seem to notice how bored Mick had become, or if he did notice, he didn't care. He just rambled on, his arguments getting windier and windier, his sentences lengthening with every mile they drove. Judd, Mick had decided, was a selfish bastard, and as soon as their honeymoon was over, he would part with the guy. It was not until their trip, that endless, motiveless caravan through the graveyards of mid-European culture, that Judd realized what a political lightweight he had in Mick. The guy showed precious little interest in the economics or politics of the countries they passed through. He registered indifference to the full facts behind the Italian situation and yawned, yes, yawned, when he had tried and failed to debate the Russian threat to world peace. He had to face the bitter truth. Mick was a queen. There was no other word for him. Alright, perhaps he didn't mince or wear jewelry to excess, but he was a queen nevertheless, happy to wallow in a dream world of early Renaissance frescoes and Yugoslavian icons. The complexities, the contradictions, even the agonies that made those cultures blossom and wither were just tiresome to him. His mind was no deeper than his looks. He was a well-groomed nobody. Some honeymoon. The road south from Belgrade to Nova Pazar was, by Yugoslavian standards, a good one. There were fewer potholes than on many of the roads that they'd traveled, and it was relatively straight. The town of Nova Pazar lay in the valley of the river Raska, south of the city named after the river. It wasn't an area particularly popular with the tourists. Despite the good road, It was still inaccessible and lacked sophisticated amenities, but Mick was determined to see the monastery at Sopakani to the west of the town, and after some bitter argument, he had won. The journey had proved uninspiring. On either side of the road, the cultivated fields looked parched and dusty. The summers had been unusually hot, and droughts were affecting many of the villages. Crops had failed, and livestock had been prematurely slaughtered to prevent them dying of malnutrition. There was a defeated look about the few faces that they glimpsed at the roadside. Even the children had dour expressions, brows as heavy as the stale heat that hung over the valley. Now, with the cards on the table after a row at Belgrade, they drove in silence most of the time, but the straight road, like most straight roads, invited dispute. When the driving was easy, the mind rooted for something to keep it engaged. And what better than a fight? "Why the hell do you want to see this damn monastery?" Judd demanded. It was an unmistakable invitation. "We've come all this way," Mick tried to keep the tone conversational. He wasn't in the mood for an argument. "More fucking virgins, is it?" Keeping his voice as even as he could, Mick picked up the guide and read aloud from it. There, some of the greatest works of Serbian painting can still be seen and enjoyed, including what many commentators agree to be the enduring masterpiece of the Raska school, the Dormition of the Virgin. Silence. Then Judd said, "I am up to here with churches. It's a masterpiece. They're all masterpieces according to that bloody book." Mick felt his control slipping. 2.5 hours at most. "I told you, I don't want to see another church. The smell of the places makes me sick. Stale incense, old sweat, lies. It's a short detour. Then we can get back on the road and you can give me another lecture on farming subsidies in the Sanzak. I'm trying to get some decent conversation going instead of this endless tripe about Serbian fucking masterpieces." "Stop the car." "What? Stop the car!" Judd pulled the Volkswagen to the side of the road. Mick got out. The road was hot, but there was a slight breeze. He took a deep breath and wandered into the middle of the road. Empty of traffic and pedestrians in both directions. In every direction, empty. The hills shimmered in the heat of the fields. There were wild poppies growing there in the ditches. Mick crossed the road, squatted on his haunches, and picked one. Behind him, he heard the VW's door slam. "What did you stop us for?" Judd said. His voice was edgy, still hoping for that argument, begging for it. Mick stood up, playing with the poppy. It was close to seeding, late in the season. The petals fell from the receptacle as soon as he touched them, little splashes of red fluttering down onto the gray tarmac. "I asked you a question," Judd said again. Mick looked around. Judd was standing by the far side of the car, his brows a knitted line of burgeoning anger. But handsome. Oh, yes. A face that made women weep with frustration that this one was gay. A heavy black mustache, perfectly trimmed, and eyes that you could watch forever and never see the same light in them twice. Why, in God's name, thought Mick, does a man as fine as that have to be such an insensitive little shit? Judd returned the look of contemptuous appraisal, staring at the pouting pretty boy across the road. It made him want to puke, seeing the little act Mick was performing for his benefit. It might have been plausible in a 16-year-old virgin, but in a 25-year-old man, it lacked credibility. Mick dropped the flower, then untucked his t-shirt from his jeans. A tight stomach, then a slim, smooth chest were revealed as he pulled it off. His hair was ruffled when he reappeared, and his face wore a broad grin. Judd looked at the torso. Neat, not too muscular. An appendix scar peering over his faded jeans. A small gold chain, catching the sun, dipped in the hollow of his throat. Without meaning to, he returned Mick's grin, and a kind of peace was made between them. Mick was unbuckling his belt. "Wanna fuck?" he said, the grin not faltering. "It's no use," came an answer, though not to that question. "What isn't?" "We're not compatible." "Wanna bet?" Now he unzipped and turned away toward the wheat field that bordered the road. Judd watched as Mick cut a swath through the swaying sea, his back the color of the grain, so that he was almost camouflaged by it. This was a dangerous game, screwing in the open air. This wasn't San Francisco, or even Hampstead Heath. Nervously, Judd glanced along the road, still empty in both directions. And Mick was turning deep in the field, turning and smiling and waving like a swimmer buoyed up in a golden surf. Oh, what the hell, there was nobody to see, nobody to know, just the hills, liquid in the heat haze, their forested backs bent to the business of the earth, and a lost dog sitting at the edge of the road waiting for some lost master. Judd followed Mick's path through the wheat, unbuttoning his shirt as he walked. Field mice ran ahead of him, scurrying through the stalks as the giant came their way, his feet like thunder. Judd saw their panic and smiled. He meant no harm to them, but then how were they to know that? He'd put out maybe 100 lives, mice, beetles, worms, before he reached that spot where Mick was lying, stark bollock naked on a bed of trampled grain, still grinning. It was good love they made. Good and strong, equal in pleasure for both. There was a precision to their passion, sensing the moment when effortless delight became urgent, when desire became necessity. They locked together, limb around limb, tongue around tongue, in a knot only orgasm could untie, their backs alternately scorched and scratched as they rolled around, exchanging blows and kisses. In the thick of it, creaming together, they heard the foot of a tractor passing by, but they were past caring. They made their way back to the Volkswagen with body-thrashed wheat in their hair and ears, their socks between their toes. Their grins had been replaced with easy smiles. The truce, if not permanent, would last a few hours at least. The car was baking hot, and they had to open the windows and doors to let the breeze cool it before they started back towards Nova Pizar. It was 4 o'clock and there was still an hour's driving ahead. As they got into the car, Mick said, "We'll forget the monastery, huh?" Judd gaped. "I thought I couldn't bear another fucking virgin." They laughed lightly together, then kissed, tasting each other and themselves, a mingling of saliva and the aftertaste of salt semen. The following day was bright, not particularly warm. No blue skies, just an even layer of white cloud. The morning air was sharp in the lining of the nostrils, like ether or peppermint. Václav Jalovsek watched the pigeons in the main square of the Popolak courting death as they skipped and fluttered ahead of the vehicles that were buzzing around, some about military business, some civilian. An air of sober intention barely suppressed the excitement he felt on this day, an excitement that he knew was shared by every man, woman, and child in Popolek. Shared by the pigeons, too, for all he knew. Maybe that was why they played under the wheels with such dexterity, knowing that on this day of days no harm could come to them. He scanned the sky again, that same white sky he'd been peering at since dawn. The cloud layer was low, not ideal for the celebrations. A phrase passed through his mind, an English phrase that he'd heard from a friend, "to have your head in the clouds." It meant, he gathered, to be lost in a reverie or a white, sightless dream. That, he thought wryly, was all the West knew about clouds, that they stood for dreams. It took a vision that they lacked to make a truth out of that casual turn of phrase. Here, in these secret hills, wouldn't they create a spectacular reality from those idle words, a living proverb, ahead in the clouds? Already, the first contingent was assembling in the square. There were only 1 or 2 absentees owing to illness, but the auxiliaries were ready and waiting to take their places. Such eagerness, such wide smiles when an auxiliary heard his or her name and number called and was taken out of line to join the limb that was already taking shape. On every side, miracles of organization, everyone with a job to do and a place to go. There was no shouting or pushing. Indeed, voices were scarcely raised above an eager whisper. He watched in admiration as the work of positioning and buckling and roping went on. It was going to be a long and arduous day. Václav had been in the square since an hour before dawn, drinking coffee from imported plastic cups, discussing the half-hourly meteorological reports coming from Pristina and Mitrovica, and watching the starless sky as the gray light of morn crept across it. Now he was drinking his 6th coffee that day, and it was barely 7 o'clock. Across the square, Metzinger looked as tired and anxious as Václav felt. They'd watched the dawn seep out of the east together, Metzinger and he. But now they'd separated, forgetting previous companionship, and would not speak until the contest was over. After all, Metzinger was from Podojevo. He had his own city to support in the coming battle. Tomorrow they'd exchange the tales of their adventures, but for today they must behave as if they didn't know each other, not even to exchange a smile. For today, they had to be utterly partisan, only caring for the victory of their own city over the opposition. Now the first leg of Popolak was erected, to the mutual satisfaction of Metzinger and Václav. All the safety checks had been meticulously made, and the leg left the square, its shadow falling hugely across the face of the town hall. Václav sipped the sweet coffee and allowed himself a little grunt of satisfaction. Such days, filled with glory, with the snapping flags and high stomach-turning sights, enough to last a man a lifetime. It was a golden foretaste of heaven. Let America have its simple pleasures, its cartoon mice and candy-coated castles, its cults and technologies. He wanted none of it. The greatest wonder of the world was here, hidden in the hills. Ah, such days. In the main square of Podojevo, the scene was no less animated, no less inspiring. Perhaps there was a muted sense of sadness underlying this year's celebration, but that was understandable. Nita Obrenović, Podojevo's loved and respected organizer, was no longer living. The previous winter had claimed her at her age of 94, leaving the city bereft of her fierce opinions and her fiercer proportions. For 60 years, Nita had worked with the citizens of Podojevo, always planning for the next contest and improving on the designs, her energies spent in making the creation more ambitious and more lifelike than the last. Thank you for listening to the first part of our tale of metropolitan madness. Join us next time for the second part, and in the meantime, stay scary and make the most of your nights.